crucial in the last 2.5 years. Lots of bold rhetoric from the White House, but lots of faltering drip, drip, drip approach to supplying military equipment. And of course, America's now heading for a crucial election in a couple of months' time. So tell us, in your view, having sat at the Situation Room, why is the US dragging its feet and supplying less than is actually needed?
Well, first of all, let me just thank Victor and congratulate you and your team on what is already an extraordinary conference. And I feel obligated also to recognize a former Prime Minister of Ukraine, the hero of many of us in this room, for being with us also. And of course, what a privilege it is to be on this panel. Look, I've sat at the Situation Room table and in 3 different 4-star assignments, commands of war, and then as the director of the CIA. And I should just note up front that it's a lot easier to sit up here and to question why they are cautious around the Situation Room table than it is when you're sitting at that table, because you feel the weight of decision much greater, and there is often reason for caution. If I was to summarize what we have seen, I think the U.S. administration, I'm non-political, by the way, I don't even register to vote. I am affiliated with no party, and I advise members of either party, including this White House, but also including some in the opposition. I think the U.S. responded very admirably when the war began, after having, of course, warned Russia, Ukraine, everyone else that this actually was going to happen. And the magnitude of the response has been staggering. Just the latest level of assistance alone, $61 billion, is larger than every defense budget in Europe, I believe. So we shouldn't say that this is not an incredible amount of support. I would also note, though, that the EU countries, NATO countries in aggregate, have actually given more together when you take humanitarian assistance, security, and financial assistance all together than the U.S. has. So we should acknowledge that, after all the years of carping about the Europeans doing more, they actually have done vastly more, and it's very impressive. But what has happened over time is that there has been, again, occasionally understandable caution in the beginning. Will the Ukrainians fight, or are we going to see a replay of what we just saw in Kabul, where all of our sophisticated systems will end up in the hands of the Russians? That was answered very quickly. In fact, it was answered in the early hours of the war when the Prime Minister said he didn't want to ride, he wanted ammunition, and he was going to stay in Kyiv, and we're all going to stay in Kyiv. Then there were concerns, of course, about, I think, legitimate concerns about possible escalation. And we saw that, the nuclear saber rattling, and the U.S. answered, I think, properly in those cases. But then I think we have been overcautious. We have seen this with the delay in decision on M1 tanks, U.S. tanks, which delayed the approval by the German government of other countries giving their Leopard tanks to Ukraine, and that hurt the offensive last summer. We saw incredible foot dragging on F-16s when we knew there's no alternative but to have to go to a Western aircraft. There are no more MiGs to give to Ukraine. We saw it with the Army Tactical Missile System. We saw it with the multiple launch rocket system, with the cluster munitions, dual purpose improved. Each of these, and we knew that sooner or later they're going to say yes, and they eventually did, but it's after this kind of foot dragging. And the latest, of course, I hope will be resolved today during a meeting between the UK Prime Minister and the US President in Washington. They are meeting there today. My understanding is that the UK has already lifted the restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow on Russian soil. And my hope is, especially after President Biden and then Secretary of State Blinken have both hinted that we will lift the restrictions on the use of our Army Tactical Missile System, which will open up a whole additional group of bases and locations from which Russia has launched aircraft and missiles and others at Ukraine. And we've seen what they have done with these missiles in recent weeks as well, destroying the most important children's hospital in Kyiv and so forth. This should have long ago been lifted, and I do not believe it will lead to any kind of escalation. Somebody asked me the other day, so what won't Russia do more? Russia is already doing everything it possibly can using the most indiscriminate weapons of enormous caliber and explosive weight, 6,000-pound glide bombs that are just hitting wherever they end up. And we should have long since lifted the restrictions that would enable Ukraine to push the delivery systems out of the range and to go after it. Let's not forget, every single day and night, the Ukrainians are using their own indigenously produced systems, and I see no difference between them using their systems to go after Russian airfields and refineries and so forth, and using our systems in that way.
So just to be clear here, I mean, a couple of points. Firstly, I think pending the meeting in Washington, the British government hasn't made a formal announcement yet, but it's certainly signaled
It's out
internally.
there. I mean, there's been signaling.
We'll be hearing from British parliamentarian
Right.
in a moment, but two quick questions before I want to turn to Timothy Snyder, who's sitting in America and sees how the political climate's unfolding. One, to make it clear, you would support the unrestricted use of long-range missiles, would you? And do you think the American military would? And the second question is, why has it taken so long to get to that point? Was it unfounded concern about nuclear threats? Was that the main issue?
Well, first of all, yes to the first question, absolutely, and every other system that we provide them for that matter. And then the second, I really can't read what this is. I assume it is, again, a concern about escalation. And, you know, there's a process, and I've been part of that process. And you don't jump the process all that often. We should have in this case. I think this is a pretty straightforward decision, but it's probably worked its way through. And you're at the point where presumably the president has made a decision, given the statements he made the other day and that Blinken made when he was here, and that this will be forthcoming. And I think they probably are staging it so that this will be the big, you know, you always have to have some announcement when you have a summit meeting, as we're having today, the first summit with the new UK Prime Minister in Washington. And hopefully this will be one of the, quote, deliverables that were decided before the onset of this meeting.
Right, well, let's hope so. I'd like to turn to you, Professor Snyder, because